Okay, we're on live right now. Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. This is Never Again Live. Last night, we had some technical complications with the show, with the volume. We're doing it again tonight, and everything tests fine. I'm going to ask everyone who is watching tonight if you could please share this with the various social media platforms that you use, be it Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, WhatsApp groups. We'd appreciate it. We'll reach a lot more people. Tonight, we're talking about the Temple Mount. There's a lot going on right now. The Minister of Police in Israel, Itamar Ben-Gvir, he just changed the dynamic right now on the Temple Mount, and I hope it holds up. Itamar Ben-Gvir is only going to permit during Ramadan Muslims who are up to the age of 12 entry, and Muslims who are above the age of 55. We don't want a repetition of what happened last year when there was clear incitement going on during Ramadan. There were Hamas rallies, there were Hamas flags, there were chants, "Death to Jews." We sent out a petition calling on the government of Israel to implement the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism on the Temple Mount and to enforce the law. We're going to be discussing it tonight. There's some interesting dynamics going on in the past couple of days. Jordan has taken to the media to make remarks against Israel. They're saying that a statement by member of Knesset Bezalel Smotrich, where he said there is no such thing as a distinctive Palestinian people, and he displayed a map of Israel, which actually included Jordan. The government of Jordan, they're threatening to cut off, to break away from whatever the peace treaty was between Israel and Jordan. It works both ways. Israel supplies water to Jordan, as well as so much other security, everything else. Jordan wouldn't exist if Israel didn't provide security for them. The king wouldn't exist if Israel didn't provide him with security. If they're going to break away from the peace treaty, that could have ramifications on the Temple Mount as well, because Israel cooperates with the Jordanian Walk, which restricts Jews from doing some basic procedures in our way of life. Praying, learning Torah, discussing Torah with fellow Jews, and Passover, just over a week away. Really, there's to be a groundswell of Jews going to the Temple Mount to pray. We're going to be discussing this all tonight. So I have great people with me. I have Mayor Jolowitz, who is a former director of the Zionist Organization of America. He lectures on university campuses. He writes articles all the time. Also, we have Henry Shiner, who is a director with the Lawfare Project. They take on anti-Semites, and in fact, they're active also, from what I understand, about the Temple Mount as well. So we're going to be discussing this tonight. Looking forward to the discussion, and please pay attention, everyone, and again, please share this. Let's first bring on Mayor Jolowitz. Let me ask everyone who's joining us, Mayor and Henry, that first opening remarks, if you could just do 2-3 minutes opening remarks on this issue, and then we'll get into back and forth discussions between all of us on the issues. Mayor, go ahead.
Okay, pleasure to join you. My remarks will be quite quite brief. Israel is a nation in crisis, and it's in crisis because of problems external and problems internal. The external, and we've discussed this in detail in other programs, perhaps most importantly is the threat, an existential threat posed by a possible or an impending Iranian nuclear military capability. That's what we should be dealing with. But instead, Israel is completely overwhelmed by the civil strife that we see in the streets, that internal problem. And the question about Israel's legitimacy is posed not only from the outside at the United Nations, as we've perennially seen it, but it's now a question that's being asked by Israel's citizens. The question I think that we will ask tonight, and it's more than rhetorical, is why is it that Israel's legitimacy as a democratically elected government, why is that being challenged today, not from the outside, but rather from the inside? And I'm sure that that'll be much of what we talk about tonight.
Absolutely. Henry?
Thank you for those comments, Mayor. On that same note, the Lawfare Project was set up as a organization, a legal think tank, to take on the phenomena of lawfare, which is the use of the law as a weapon of war. And Western nations' legal systems are being used as theaters of war, if you will, in which our enemies are using our laws as a way to disempower and undermine the values that are the very foundations of our society. And we are operating, we oversee a cooperative network of over 500 lawyers internationally. We're operating in 12 countries around the world. We have over 100 outstanding litigations on a wide range of issues. My area of expertise is in connection to the issue of the title and sovereign legal rights that the nation of Israel, the Jewish people, possess both in the context of international law and Israeli constitutional law. The way that I understand the foundation of our problems at the national level of the state of Israel is, in my mind, directly connected to the misunderstanding and the obfuscation of our actual rights as a sovereign entity within the family of nations. That really, it's really quite once you actually understand and learn the truth, it's really quite an astounding fact that our sovereignty is really being questioned. And when in fact, beyond, and the source of that is, of course, historic events, an enemy who is committed to overthrowing our status as an independent nation state for their own cultural, ideological, spiritual reasons based in Islamic thought and ideology, and a leadership, an Israeli political leadership, that fundamentally does not understand those rights that they should in fact be there, that they're legally obligated to assert, and that they should be communicating as a matter of foreign policy. I think that the situation that we see on the Temple Mount, which is, it's fundamentally illegal. Israel is the full sovereign over all of, legally speaking, over all of Israel / Palestine. Jordan is a non-entity. In fact, technically, in law, Jordan is in fact an illegal state. The state of Jordan exists on the sovereign territory of the Jewish people. And so it is absurd, prima facie, that you have an illegal state that is on our land who has, and especially in regard to the Temple Mount, has sovereign control of the Temple Mount, and is, in fact, has the temerity currently to be calling out us in regard to violations of rights and law. So it's my mission to clarify these issues, and I hope in tonight's conversation to be able to pass some ideas that bring these issues into clear focus as it's viewed through the eyes of the law and the correct historical facts.
No, listen, absolutely. I mean, it certainly isn't static for a moment. What's going on in Israel? It's very dynamic. The changes that we're witnessing. Not only are we seeing these protests, and there's even a report that there were some Jews who are involved in the protests in Israel that are talking about leaving and finding some other place to live, reinvesting their money outside the country. I mean, there were some people in the tech industry that reinvested their money into the Silicon Valley. They lost their shirts with the downfall of the Silicon Valley banks. But it is very troubling to watch this. We even have some advocates for Israel that seem to be standing up for what they call Palestinian rights. Noah Tishby made that statement. She says she's pro-Israel and pro-Palestinian.
I saw that.
And she
So
came out strong. Yeah. Go ahead. Jump in.
So, most people, the narrative, the historical and legal narrative that most people, including the heads of our government in Israel and the diplomatic community, where they pick up on the narrative as, how did the phenomenon after 2,000 years of being outside of the land, how all of a sudden in the 20th century did millions of B'nai Israel Jews return back to the land of Israel and establish a functioning society? How did that actually logistically happen? What motivated that? So, of course, the narrative that most people follow is, well, it was a British colonial enterprise with the Balfour Declaration that led to this mass immigration to the land of Israel, and that the British were issued this mandate, and that they kind of invited us back, and they didn't invite us back, and then post the Second World War, after the Holocaust had occurred, the United Nations was so guilty, and that they decided to pass this resolution 181, where they would, because there'd been under the mandatory period, there'd been all this struggle, and so they wanted to bring peace, and so they divide the line, and Israel accepted it, and the Arabs rejected it, and then a few years later, their Jews were so impatient they declared a state, and the Jews, they defend them. There was the War of Independence. They defended themselves. In the end, we won, and the land got established. But those poor Palestinians got caught up in the mix of it, and too bad, so sad. They've been, since 1948, the most dispossessed people, according to them, in all of history, and we're at fault. So none of that, of course, is true. But that is the narrative, unfortunately, that the government of Israel operates their foreign policy around. Or that's not completely true. There's elements of truth that are in that, but that is not the true narrative. The foreign policy, the judiciary, the diplomatic circles, it's all based around this distortion. And so it's important to know, and I'm just going to briefly go over the events that actually led to the Jewish people, although our true deed is the Torah. The Torah was the covenant. It's the covenant through our forefathers. Is recorded in the Torah that there's a covenant between Am Yisrael and Hashem and God, that he gave us a land of Israel. The Torah is our deed. That's in a universal cosmic sense. And so to convince people of those arguments, some are convinced by it, but lots are not. So what's interesting about this, and I was just speaking to a colleague today about this very issue, that he said that the Lubavitcher Rebbe actually wrote a whole book on this. And as opposed to invoking the spiritual arguments, he says it's so self-evident for Western culture, the strategic importance of Israel to all of the free world. That's actually what he emphasizes. He brings down, of course, some things, but he emphasizes the actual practical, tactical, strategic importance of the land of Israel to the free world. So if you'll indulge me for a few moments, I'd just like for the audience to understand how, in fact, the Jewish people, Am Yisrael, came in the context of international law into possession of the land of Israel. So up until, from the times of pharaohs, up until the end of the First World War, there was a law. It was called the right of conquest, an international law amongst all nation states. If you went to war, if you lose the war, you lose your lands. So going into the First World War, which was the first true war in which modern societies were able to use their industrial capacity to wage war, and that the slaughter was enormous. Like, even when we say today, and we look at both the First and the Second World War, which those are the experiments of which our new ability to industrialize our material affairs were applied to warfare. But the First World War itself was the scale of the slaughter and the death was so enormous that on the other side of the war, just, to give you a sample, just the nation of France in 4 years lost 4 million soldiers. If you just think about it as a generation, they wiped out in a matter of 4 years, they wiped out an entire generation, never mind all the other death and casualty, destruction of everything. But on the other side of the war, it was apparent that there was no economic calculus to war that made sense anymore. Previously, if you went to war, it was, although it evolved over time, but more or less, at the end of the war, there was a net benefit. You got lands, you got people, there was assets that you gathered. So from the perspective of the sovereigns, which were the monarchies, the kings and the queens, it was a way to expand empires. But by the time history evolved and modernity was taking root, and on the end of the First World War, it was apparent to the leaders of the most advanced nation states of the world, which were the leaders of the Allied efforts, Britain, France, Italy, Japan, and all the Allied nations, it didn't make any sense anymore. There's no net benefit to it. And that the events that they put into place post World War I reflected that view of the world. So the new institution that was created was the League of Nations, which was the precursor to the United Nations, which became a diplomatic forum for all nations. When they had grievances before they start shooting, they would speak to each other to see if they could sort things out. All nations signed up to that. And in the charter of the League of Nations, which was also grandfathered into the United Nations as the League of Nations collapsed before the First World War and was reconstituted post World War II, it became illegal to attack any member state of the League of Nations. So that right of conquest in legal terms was basically fell to the ash bin of history in theory and over time in practice. So the events that actually led to the Jewish people gaining our title and our sovereign legal rights are as follows. The two sides in conflict in the First World War were the Allied nations, led by the major Allied powers, which were Britain, France, Italy, Japan, and in Europe, the United States of America, against the continental powers, which were Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. The Allied nations won. And since the right of conquest was still in place, those geographic domains, those regions, literally became the property, everything, all the assets, they became the legal property of the victorious side, which were the Allied nations. So Germany, the former Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria, we had as the victors, the Allied nations, the full legal right of disposition. We could have done whatever we wanted to do with it, in principle. So the war ends in November of 1918. From January to June of 1919, they hold something called the Paris Peace Conference, where they made all the peace settlement terms to affect all the changes in the European theater. And during the peace conference in Paris, they introduced an innovation in international law. It was something called the mandate system. It was introduced by a South African statesman. His name is Jan Christian Smuts. At that point, he was part of the British Imperial War Cabinet. And the mandate system was essentially a franchise system that brought nation states into reality. Pre the First World War, if you wanted to create a nation state, you went to a place, you stuck your pole in the ground, and you defended your borders. You either survived or you died. On the other side of the First World War, that's illegal now. And now there is an apparatus by which nation states can be brought into reality legally. The mandate system, an innovation in international law. And that was signed into law into the Treaty of Versailles. It was Article 22 of the Treaty of Versailles. And all the nations of the world signed on to that. And so in the case of the peace conferences, legally what was happening, imagine it in real estate terms. Imagine the Allied forces was a big corporation, and there was a board of directors. So just like in a public company or big corporation has lots of shareholders, when you have a board of directors and they make a resolution, it's binding on everybody. So the Allied nations, the leaders of the major Allied powers, it was called the Supreme Allied Council. They were the board of directors, if you will, of the Allied forces, and they were called the Council of 10. They were the leadership group that were affecting and putting into effect all the peace terms for the First World War, at the end of the First World War, that was binding on the whole world, really. So, in Paris, they took care of Europe. We won't go into the details of that, but all the terms that were incorporated into the Treaty of Versailles, that was the terms under which the European countries made peace with each other. 8 months later, they met in a place called San Remo, Italy, from April 19th to April 26th. And it was in San Remo that they were dismembering the former Ottoman Empire. So the difference between the Ottoman Empire and the European theater was that Europe had countries. There was countries with borders and laws and nations and culture. There was countries. It was easier to do. In the Middle East, in the Ottoman Empire, there was some civilization, which was basically in Turkey, but the rest of the Middle East was more or less desert. There was no real civilization to speak of. And at that point in history, the dot-com phenomena in that point of history was get your own nation state. The world, one of the casualties of the First World War was the sovereign control of the affairs of humanity over by the aristocratic elite. That was also from the times of Pharaoh to the First World War. They were sovereigns other than the advanced nations who were becoming independent democracies, France, the United States, Britain, Italy. There's a few nations, but as a movement in general, the fact that and these were the most advanced, sophisticated modern nations. So humanity itself understood that the citizens of the country could be the sovereigns and govern themselves. That was the zeitgeist at the time. And so everyone was lobbying to get their own nation state because it meant more freedom, better life, and all the good things that accrue to the citizens who undertake that responsibility. So it was in San Remo that where there was the first application of this new system, the mandate system, was put into practice. And so in corporate terms, imagine it's a big real estate developer, which are Allied Inc. or the Allied nations, and they have to divide up, and people, the distorted narrative is, well, the British, to the detriment of those poor Palestinian people in the extension of the colonial exercise, trampled on the rights of the Palestinians and gave it to those interloping European Jews who came over. And, that's why we have the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to this day. Nonsense. That's not what happened. What happened was the new landlords, which are the collective will of the Allied nations, represented by their board of directors called the Supreme Allied Council, decided the way that they would best manage this the former geographic areas of the Ottoman Empire was giving the right of self-determination to the people who lived in the region. And it was in San Remo that they created 3 new countries and they issued the mandates, which were the franchise agreements that put all the terms and conditions to the beneficiaries of the mandates in a treaty, that once these terms and conditions were fulfilled, it would allow the beneficiaries to become independent nation states, joining the family of nations and becoming members of the League of Nations. It was the vision that was set forth by these leaders. So on April 24th, the Supreme Allied Council, first they created 3 new countries. One was Mesopotamia. These were new legal entities. One was Syria, Lebanon. And the third was Palestine. It's now a legal country. On April 25th, they created 3 mandates or 3 franchise agreements to create nation states. They vested those mandates into the newly created countries to the beneficiaries of the local human beings who are living within those geographic terrains that were the beneficiaries of the terms and conditions of the mandates. And they they set up that system. What was unique about the mandate for Palestine in the Jewish community was that de jure sovereignty was invested in the Jewish community, of the community that was not only living in Israel, but also was living internationally all over the world. And so people go, well, that's the source of the injustice. No, again, not. So first of all, you have to understand that in a quantitative state, probably 99.9% of the entire region was given over to the Arabs for their own purpose of self-determination, which resulted in the establishment of 22 independent nation states. And from a quantitative perspective, probably 99.9% of the actually geographic region. And Palestine-Israel set aside, and it wasn't just set aside for sentimental reasons. The Jewish community had actually, as the Arabs had as well, this is the reason that they were also given these benefits, had contributed to the war effort. And indeed, many of the leaders, especially within the British government and the American government, and all the leaders really, they understood our historic claims and our indigenous rights to the land of Israel. They saw it as a historic injustice that the Romans had removed us from it. And they, as statesmen and leaders, they saw that they were righting an ancient wrong and that we had actually earned that. And so it wasn't just out of pure sympathy. There was a whole range of motives as to why they decided to give us the Palestine/Israel. They were tied into the Zionist movement at the time. And so so it was on April 25th, 1920, that the Supreme Allied Council issued forth the San Remo Resolution, which was a treaty that vested the rights into the beneficiaries of the mandates. 3 mandates, franchise system for countries, were put into reality. Mandate for Mesopotamia, which became Iraq. Mandate for Syria, which became Syria and Lebanon. And mandate for Palestine, which became Israel. So everyone says, well, of course, it was the British and the French. They were controlling all this. Again, not true. So when we say the British and the French were mandatories, that's not a linguistic term. It's a technical term. The mandatory is a trustee. So it wasn't the British or the French, based on their own national interests, that became the mandatory or the mentor or the trustee. They were both. As a mandatory, they had both the responsibilities for the beneficiaries of the mandate system. They were elected as, in metaphoric terms, they were property managers. The owners of the region are the collective allied nations. The British and the French, for logistic reasons, the militaries are on the ground. There's a range of reasons as to why they were selected, but it's important to understand it wasn't the British and the French on their own initiative doing this. They were acting on behalf of the collective interest of the allied nations as a whole. And so they were there as the mandatory, they were the trustee. Their job was to assist the beneficiaries of the mandate, to mentor them so that they could fulfill the terms of the mandate. So just like a small child, if you is a 5-year-old, you inherit a great fortune at 5 years old. Your father was a great industrialist. You have a big empire. You can't take over until you're 20 years old. Exact same. The mandatories were there to mentor the beneficiaries so that they could fulfill all the terms and conditions of the mandate, set up all the institutions required and all the infrastructure to exist as a state within the context of the modern world. And once they fulfilled it, it was actually the desire and the will of the allied nations for those beneficiaries to become full participants, independent new nation states within the family of nation states. That is exactly how, and there was a series of treaties that were signed, but that is how our title and sovereign legal rights were granted. Those rights have never been changed, and that is by right why we, the historical and legal events, why we as the nation of Israel, Jewish people, returned to the land of Israel and reconstituted our ancient patrimony, our ancient homeland and our ancient patrimony in the land of Israel. That's why we're there by right. Yes, there was a lot of historic events around that. The British did many things to They undermined our rights. We won't go into those details, but it's important to understand that has nothing to do with the events of the Second World War, why we're in Israel. It's all because of the First World War, and we're there as of right.
Okay, let me bring Mayor to join us on this. Mayor Jolowitz. Mayor, you see, legal rights, it's all there, black and white. Yet it seems that Israel goes around the world like a pauper saying, we need your support. We can't exist without you. Let's hear from you, Mayor.
That was wonderful, Henry. And I concur with every syllable that was spoken. And I'm going to say something, and I don't mean to be the stick in the spokes here. As far as the historic scholarship, intellectual argument, everything that we just heard is absolutely spot on. And I dare say, and I mean this respectfully, it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. When I was finishing my graduate studies 45, 47 years ago, and I would talk about all these various agreements and the history as it was very cleverly explained right now, it seemed to matter. The Peel Commission, San Remo, all these things seemed to matter. They don't matter anymore. And I'm not speaking as someone who suggests that they should not matter. I'm suggesting that the truth isn't self-evident. It isn't important. We are now engaged in a war. Henry mentioned that he was talking about the law as a weapon of war. I've often spoken and written about the fact that we are engaged in an ongoing war. It's a war of ideas. The Arabs have realized that there's a new tool or a new vehicle that they can use in order to try and somehow cripple Israel, truncate its territorial dimensions, and make it vulnerable to a future assault on Israel in order to destroy Israel. They aren't using tanks anymore. That weapon of war which I speak about is called diplomacy. It's diplomacy. I think it was Will Rogers who said many years ago, the diplomacy is the art of saying nice doggy, and then when the dog is close enough, you strike it in the head with a rock. That is what diplomacy was. That's how Will Rogers described it, and that's exactly what the Arabs are doing. So notwithstanding everything that was said, which was beautifully crafted, it doesn't matter anymore. If I would mention, in fact, I don't know that there's an Israeli spokesman, never mind the death of Hasbara, who's actually mentioned anything that Henry mentioned in any speech that was given, let's just say in the last 365 days. Not one. Irrelevant. Now, he mentioned Resolution 181. Remarkable how the Arabs, and we know the history, rejected Resolution 181 until last July. In July, Mahmoud Abbas stands next to Joe Biden and asks that the United States be used as a tool to pressure Israel to once again re-implement Resolution 181. Not only Resolution 181, but also Resolution 194. All the refugees, all the Arabs, the exponential number of Arabs who seem to grow, the number of Arab refugees that exist according to Arab authorities is much greater when we complete this little podcast than it was when we began it, and by significant numbers. The truth isn't relevant. And again, that isn't me speaking, it's me identifying what's happening out there. The truth isn't relevant. And I've often said, and I'm careful to criticize Israel in the context of non-Jewish, non-pro-Israel circles, because people are going to turn around and say, well, why should we be more Catholic than the Pope? But it's our fault. To a great extent, it's our fault. Everything that Henry said was absolutely right. And the course of action which it portends seems to be quite clear to anyone who's a clear thinker. If intellectual integrity means anything, and I wonder if it does these days, then we should indeed take everything that was said as a premise by my colleague Henry, and we should therefore act accordingly. And we, our side, Israel's spokesman, has decided it's not important anymore. I have often said, including on this podcast in previous sessions, that September 13th, 1993 was the most tragic day in the history of modern Israel. I mean, others, historians, will talk about the casualties of the Yom Kippur War and so on and so forth. On September 13th, 1993, with the signing of the Oslo Peace Accords, and if you notice the way that I peace, you heard those quotations around it. Our side, and we are the ones who are right, we're the ones who are just, we're the ones who are moral, we're the ones who are deserving. Our side, in essence, surrendered to our enemies, to our murderers, by suggesting that on the other side of that diplomatic table sat a peace partner. When Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres, and we remember Yitzhak Rabin's feeble handshake, when he reached out and offered that feeble handshake to Yasser Arafat, he in essence made kosher the murderer of more Jewish children and women and children than anyone since, of course, the days of the Holocaust. We made them kosher, and they remain kosher. Today, when people, and I say this with that same respect to the comments that were made by Envy, when others don't want to talk about the past, the mandate, the fall of the Ottoman Empire and the British, and 78% of the land actually went to Transjordan in 1922 and on. It's irrelevant for the rest of it. We have allowed something terrible to happen, and which is we've allowed language to be used as a tremendous weapon against our cause. Today, we don't have an Arab-Israeli conflict. When I began lecturing, oh my God, almost 50 years ago, I spoke about, in a generic sense, at least it had a generic interpretation, the Arab-Israeli conflict. It seemed to be almost a value-free comment, the Arab-Israeli conflict. The Arab-Israeli conflict should have been defined since day one as the Arab war against Israel, or to be more expansive, the Muslim war against the Jews, especially if we now want to incorporate the Islamic Republic of Iran. Instead, what we've done, our side, the ones who are supposed to be arguing the case that was made so beautifully now by Henry, our side has actually surrendered language to the point where we aren't talking about an Arab war against Israel. We're not talking about an Arab-Israeli conflict. We're talking about an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And we all know what that portends. If it's an Israeli-Palestinian conflict, well, it means that there are two parties, and in order to assuage all concerns, well, each of them is deserving of a country. And it's always the Israelis who are beating up the Palestinians. The underdog today is the Palestinians. And every Israeli spokesman who goes to the United Nations talks about an Israeli-Palestinian dispute, a conflict. And in doing so, we have basically laid the foundation for a war of words, a war of ideas, a war that we are losing. And the reason is because we don't have anyone who's bold enough to stand up and say what needs to be said, that this is nonsense, that the Palestinians, you mentioned Smotrich, that the Palestinians didn't exist as a separate nation. It is fraudulent. And it's remarkable how the state of Israel today, Smotrich among those who were compelled to apologize for the misunderstanding about the existence of a viable Palestinian entity. We're afraid to say that in 1964, when the PLO was formed, when the PLO was formed officially with its charter, which they refer to as a covenant, covenant, obviously the implication of some kind of a religious connection, that its articles, the 33 articles, are immutable, even though they were modified in 1968. The point that I'm trying to make is that we have been playing the game by the rules which were established by our enemies, and not only by our enemies, by those people who sit ostensibly as neutral observers of this conflict, and even worse, American Jewish organizations, every Reform rabbi in America, who basically says it's an Israeli-Palestinian conflict and it's to be settled, it's to be decided by establishing, as it was intended, they contend, a Palestinian state. Yes, the Arabs made a mistake in rejecting it in 1981, so let's correct that mistake. We are playing their game by their rules, using their language, and I dare say, without wishing to sound like a pessimist or Cassandra, we are playing a losing game. And the only way we will win this game is to stand firm and be unapologetic. Jabotinsky, in 1911, in the Iron Wall, he wrote about excessive apology, that the time is, in 1911, that the time has come for the Jews to stop engaging in excessive apology. Who are they to put us on trial, and who are we to answer to them? We came before them, we will outlive them. And that is the case. However, that happens to be a minority opinion. One last thing. When I talk about the fact that today, not only Israel's enemies, but those who ostensibly claim to be Israel's friends, when they take a position, well, the only solution is, well, it's a very simple formula for peace in the Middle East. Israel gives and the Arabs get. And done properly, if the lines are drawn in a proper place, let's take the map, let's draw the lines where they ought to be drawn. No one knows where that is. And all of a sudden we will have peace. Our enemy, which is dedicated to our destruction, will come to recognize the benevolence of Jews and somehow allow us to live among others in the family of nations. We've got to stand up. We've got to say no. There comes a point when one simply is allowed to say no. The one thing that we're afraid to say is that not every problem has a solution. No one is willing to say that. Not every problem has a solution. And today and tomorrow, when you go to the streets of Tel Aviv and elsewhere, you will see the attempt to delegitimize the Jewish state, not coming from Iraq, from Mesopotamia, not coming from Syria, coming from Ramat Aviv. We, my friends, are in trouble.
Mayor, we've discussed before on the show Israel as an emerging superpower. How could it be an emerging superpower groveling? What's with the psyche of Jews? Why is that?
If I may, Mayor, I'd like to, first
Go
of
ahead.
all, Mayor, much of what Mayor said, yes, they are. I think that the Oslo Accords it's really incomprehensible, inconceivable as to why the Israeli government did this. It is fundamentally illegal, not only in international law, in the context of Israeli constitutional law. The Oslo Accords are prima facie illegal. They're illegal in many areas of Israeli law. Any politician, lawyer, or anybody who is actively participating in the execution of any of the terms of the Oslo Accords is, by Israeli constitutional law, committing treason against the state of Israel. Minimum punishment, 10 years in prison or the death penalty. They should be annulled. It is an absolutely tragic event. And as Mayor pointed out, it has been playing right into the hands of our enemies. I think it's important to understand is what Mayor was saying is that the conflict that Israel faces against the Islamic Arab neighbors is actually a jihadi war. And so under the terms of Sharia law, the concept of an independent nation state is a Western political construct. The Islamic view of sovereignty is different. In the Islamic view of sovereignty, Allah is the sovereign of the world. There are only 3 categories of human beings. In order to be straight with God, you have to be a Muslim. You're according to a Sharia, you're a tzaddik if you're a Muslim. However, because in the Quran gives a nod to Moshe Rabbeinu and our friend Yashki, that Christians and Jews we have a special status because Muhammad, in his expansive view of reality, was able to incorporate teachings from both Moshe and Yashki, that we have the status we're called dhimmi. So we're as kind of like a second-class citizen, and we're allowed to practice our own faith. We're allowed our own houses of worship. However, if we're riding our horse along the road and a Muslim is coming the other way, we have to dismount, take the reins of our horse in our hand, and bow our heads as we walk by the Muslim. That's the dhimmi. The third status of human beings is called a harbi, or a disbeliever. They have no rights whatsoever. And so in the Islamic mission, so many times, and I used to watch these speeches of the Ayatollah, the Ayatollahs or Ahmadinejad, you'd see them speaking, and they'd be saying, when Islam conquers the world from all the mountaintops to this, and you're listening, as a Western educated individual, you're going like, these people are completely crazy. Like, what are they talking about? They're actually talking about their fundamental beliefs. They believe they've been invoked with the franchise from Allah to conquer all of planet Earth. And the sovereign, under fundamental Islamic law, the geographic regions which are under Islamic sovereignty is called the Ummah. So there's Dar al-Islam, which is the Ummah, which is the Islamic sovereign territory, and there's Dar al-Harb, or Harb in Hebrew, which is sword, which is lands which are under the sword or military conflict until they become Dar al-Islam. Once a geographic region has been under Islamic sovereignty, that's it for history. It never reverts back. However, if Allah, in his infinite wisdom, decides to temporarily cede sovereign control by the Ummah, by the Islamic Caliph over the Ummah, that gives the Muslim the chance to wage jihad to get back those lands and bring it back into and reconnect the sovereignty back into the Ummah. And there's two ways to wage jihad. One is a kinetic war, outright kinetic warfare. The other is through diplomatic intrigue, and that's done under the premise of the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. That was a treaty that Muhammad entered into. And that's actually an even more meritorious way to accomplish the jihad. It's through diplomatic intrigue and cunning in order to achieve the same end. That is what the jihad, in addition, so the Arabs they see that they can't defeat us militarily, so they're waging the jihad diplomatically, and that is what we're up against. So to the point that Mayor made, and why I think the truth of the law is such an important weapon in that fight, is that the truth of the matter is there is no actual physical fight between us and the Palestinians. If the Prime Minister's office gave the order to attack, 24 hours later, there would be no live Arab Palestinians in the areas where they're living inside of Eretz Israel. It'd be a complete slaughter. There's no real conflict in that regard. There's a decimation if we used our military might to enforce our will. So in as much as they're not going to do that, the ability to contextualize our rights in legal terms to the nations of the world who signed treaties acknowledging all of our rights, all the nations of humanity are legally obligated and are treaty obligated and have acknowledged that we, Am Yisrael, the Jewish people, are the sovereign in Palestine. We can stay up in the UN whatever all the resolutions they come up, and whatever types of rights they want to give the so-called Palestinian people, that is not only in violation of the UN Charter itself. The way we convince our friends in the international community to say, like, by the way, I know these forgotten, but here are the laws, right? These are your laws. By law, we're here. I don't know why you want to break the law in order to get your diplomatic point across, but you shouldn't be doing that. I'm couching terms, but that's the message we deliver. And so in that way, it puts everything back on their heels, like, because they're in a whole narrative of two people, the just way. Oh, we all know the narrative. this puts them back in their place, and all of a sudden they have to deal with reality again. So from a moral perspective, it rebalances the scale. So we need to skillfully deliver that message internationally at the UN through foreign policy, and also internally within the citizens of Israel, because most of them are educated in the distortion. That's why you have all the protests and all the conflict that exists internally within Israel, because the way in which the narrative in regard to the Palestinian has been contextualized, it seems like we are acting as immoral tyrants, if you will, to the detriment of this other independent people that have rights that we're denying, which is totally false. In addition to that, that's using the knowledge of our legal rights in the context of international law for diplomacy, and that internally in diplomatic arenas, as well as internally within the nation state of Israel, but also Israeli constitutional law. Any government of the state of Israel that cedes a single inch of the land of Israel in the context is forbidden in so many laws in Israel, but at a basic level, they are literally committing treason according to Israeli constitutional law. So to have a group like the Lawfare Project who can stand up and say, by the way, we're going to hold your feet to your job is not to ignore the law. Your job as a legislator and as a member of the Knesset is to enforce existing laws. Judges are there to opine on existing laws, not to deny them, not to break the law, but to enforce the law. So by drawing the attention to these laws which have become obscured and which our politicians have engaged in all sorts of illegal acts like the terrible Oslo Accords, we can use the legal system to force our rights, upholding all the laws of democracy, the rule of law. And that is how and why it's so important for us to use the law in this war of diplomacy to assert our rights. And literally, the Israeli government is literally legally obligated right now to assert de facto sovereignty on all areas in which the IDF is in firm administrative control. So, to Mayor's point, I think that there is where he has in some ways is not of the opinion that law can be used to resolve the issue. On the contrary, I believe that it is the actual. Any law only has its power if you have people who are willing to assert it. So first you have to know about the law, then you have to assert it. And I don't believe that Israel has totally abandoned the rule of law. I just think that the strategies and the knowledge of how to use a law haven't been there by the right leadership to assert it in order to achieve our righteous aims.
Let me just jump in here for a moment and throw this out. Okay, so we have a new government in Israel, a new coalition government in Israel. And the Minister of Police is now Itamar Ben-Gvir. How did Itamar Ben-Gvir become so popular that he was able to get such a significant position? Well, the previous government, the Naftali Bennett coalition government with Yair Lapid and with the Arab parties, who deny the right of a Jewish state to exist, and I can go on and on and on. But there was a rash of terrorist attacks, for instance, last year. And I was in Israel during that period of time. And Itamar would make it a point to show up at every single location where it was taking place and question the Minister of Police at the time, who was a pathetic left-winger. And this made the news, and he made it a point to, he believed 100% in what he was doing, Itamar, but he made it a point, and Israelis saw that. They saw the passion. They saw that he cares and wants to affect change in Israel. We showed a little video clip of Ramadan from last year, where there were Hamas rallies on the IHRA, where they were screaming, chanting, Kaibar, Kaibar, Yeh Yehud, the armies of Muhammad are coming for you. The past 24 hours, Jordan is going completely insane with the statement that Smotrich made, to the point that a member of parliament in Jordan, get this, a member of parliament in Jordan took an Israeli flag and placed it on the floor in front of the parliament building in Jordan, and he stepped on it. He walked on it. A member of the Jordanian parliament. There are other members of the Jordanian parliament who are calling for now a war against Israel. When these statements are made from Jordan by members of parliament, and where do I find this? Where did I find the video of the Jordanian member of parliament walking, desecrating an Israeli flag? Where did I find it? I found it searching the internet. A blogger, Elder of Zion. She's wonderful. She posts great stuff. But I found it on a blog, and it just happened. It's not making the news. There's no members of Knesset taking issue with it. There's complete silence going on. So as we have the just cause, our legal rights, everything, there's no passion from our leaders to take on Jordan. They get a complete pass. You could say whatever you want. It's almost like we are accepting guilt. And then to flip it over, when you have Noah Tishby that goes on Bill Maher's show, which is widely watched, and she says, I'm pro-Israel, I'm pro-Palestinian. I mean, it's like what Mayor Jolowitz has always said, we are the enemy. We shoot ourselves in the foot. So, with everything that we have going for us, all the legal rights, and an emerging superpower, we're acting like beggars. We're going around, like Rabbi Meir Kahana would say, we go around the world with a pushka. Support us, please support. We need your charity. We need you to pat us on the head. When is that going to end? And especially what's going on right now, the past 24 hours, when Jordan, and there's many members of parliament in Jordan that are going completely insane with their statements, their anti-Semitic statements, and walking on Israeli flags. And by the way, it was about a week ago or 2 weeks ago at the airport, they took a pair of tefillin from an Orthodox Jew and they cut it up. Oh, you might use this as some kind of weapon. It might be dangerous. They cut up tefillin, our peace partner. Where is our self-respect? Where is our diplomacy to really go in high gear against these anti-Semites?
You know, I think if when as you dig into the history, modern history, the laws and the facts, and you just, when I study this material and my mentors who are, I'm standing on the shoulder of legal giants, really. But when you look at the facts, and when I'm learning this and meditating, I often say to myself, like, how did this actually? How do we find ourselves in the position that we find ourselves in today? I think, which is the question that you're asking. And I think that if you look at things in context, like for instance, thank God that we are in a position of this, objectively in this position of incredible power and accomplishment. The state of Israel as it exists today is a living miracle. Like, if I often say this to myself and my friends, I said, if our ancestors of 100 years ago would understand what Israel is today and how easy it is for us to go live there, and they would think that we were still staying in the exile, not moving there, they would, no forgiveness. They think we'd completely lost our mind. Israel is a miracle. We shouldn't lose fact of, with all of its problems and all of its challenges that we need to. It is an incredible miracle. And so, but if you look at how it got to be the miracle, it was a lot of hard work. So the actual heavy lifting, although it's a modern marvel and technologically, and it has every luxury that you can possibly imagine is available in Israel, we have to remember that for the first 40 plus years, a lot of hard work. And so in addition to the fact, and that we were in a very material and real sense dependent on our allies who were not nice to us. There's a fabulous book written by John Loftus. It's called The Secret War Against the Jews.
Right.
How Western
Right.
intelligence portrayed the Jewish people. It's the most fascinating story. I highly recommend reading it. But when you look at not only the actual material challenges that the community that was living in Israel were facing on a daily basis just to kind of keep the lights on a daily basis, but then how our so-called allies and our enemies were attacking us on a daily basis, it's really a miracle that we're even around. And so, never mind that all that heavy lifting was done by Holocaust survivors and by the Jewish community that had to flee the Arab nations with the shirts on their backs, right? Like we were. So when you put in context why things have become not ideal, and you understand how we got there, it's we can have more mercy on why things went the way that they did. We shouldn't call the mistakes, victories. We should call them out and we should correct them. But in terms of us, because the job is really, it's not really, we can look for academic purposes back on all the mistakes that our predecessors made and said, why'd you do that? You should have done this, you should have done that. But guess what? The opportunity to do the right thing is actually in all of our hands right now. So we should all be asking ourselves, well, now that we know all this, why are we continuing to do the exact same things that they did that put us in the situation in the first place? Put it on ourselves. And we should all, each of us at our own level, take action according to our own awareness to work to correct those errors that will perfect and bring the situation in Israel to a higher and higher level. Look, there's a lot of challenges that are there, but we have, resource-wise, we've never had so much. I do believe that as we continue to mature our physical development of the state and the land over there, which we should continue to do with much luck, and it should expand exponentially, it is an ideological struggle, not only in the realm of modern thought and international arrangement in nation states, but even our spiritual reconnection to our own traditions, which is the foundation of our beliefs that brought us back to that. So I think it's the mix of all those things together, and each one of us taking personal responsibility from our own level and sphere of influence to make things better is what will actually make the change.
I think Mayor dropped his computer.
Oh, yes? Oh, okay. Oh.
Okay.
Yes,
Gary,
Mayor is
can I
temporarily, Mayor is temporarily out of commission, but he'll be back momentarily. I see him trying. So guys, keep talking till we get him back.
Okay, so let me say this. And by the way, Gary, I noticed that the map that you put on there showed Gaza to once again fall under the status of being occupied by Israel. The way that you put that map, which is not to be laughed at. There it is. Notice that Gaza is being occupied by Israel, which is interesting because in international circles at the United Nations, they do talk about Israel's present day occupation of Gaza. To what Henry said, Henry, I agree with everything you say. What I was trying to suggest was where these things ought to matter, that the fight that we fight ought to be fought the way that you've described. We aren't allowed to do that. And part of the reason is because they refuse to recognize something that we know to such an extent that we ourselves don't recognize, we won't speak it. The war between Arab and between Arab and Jew, between Israel and its enemies, is not a war of territory. When one talks about treaties and lines and resolutions and so on and so forth, one looks at a map and one talks about where lines need to be drawn. The war that has been launched against Israel and the Jewish people is not one of territory. It isn't because of anything Israel has either done or failed to do. It's by virtue of the fact that Israel exists. The war in the Middle East it's a religious war. It's a religious war. And we need
it is actually over territory. In other words, the reason, and this is why it's important to understand the Islamic point of view. Like before I learned this, like when you actually hear like, you know, Hamas and Islamic Jihad and all the leaders, they know that from the river to the sea, Palestine. When you listen to that, I'm going like, are these people like completely mashuga out of their minds? They are, but I'm saying, but even like where does that come from? It is actually, it's important to understand, and this is strategically why the Muslims, the terrorist organizations have been able to outmaneuver the Israeli government, because we don't actually understand the rules of the game that they're playing. Their rules is that they're allowed to lie and deceive us, and that they're waging a jihad.
It's our fault.
Yes, it is our fault. It is our fault. It is our fault. But I'm saying, what we have to do is say, hey, we know the game. We know that you're trying to get back the territory. We know that but call it out. Your religion, your religion motivated. We guess every time they yeah. Every time they attempt to pull the card, like we just shine light on it, and that they're after our lands, and they'll never stop ever. Well, the fundamental the Haredi part of the Islamic world will never stop, because for them to do so, it's akin to us asking them to eat a ham and cheese sandwich by the Ne'ilah service on Yom Kippur. That, in essence, how profoundly, that principle is to them, would be, it's akin to asking them to do it. They can't. They have to surrender their belief in Islam and all of that. So we have to come to grips with that, and based on that reality, we have to design strategy and policy in order to confront it.
Okay, allow me to finish my point. The point that I was trying to make is, and here it is, Mayor had mentioned the Jordanian parliamentarian who treaded on an Israeli flag. And my response is, what did you expect him to do? He doesn't recognize Israel's right to exist. We are not only the infidel, we are the filth. We are the people who have dirtied their land. The same reason why Germany didn't have any death camps in Germany was because they didn't want Jewish blood to soil their land. This contempt. Well, the Arabs, Jordan has a treaty with Israel in 1994. Jordan recognizes Israel de facto. If one wants to talk about international language, they do not recognize Israel de jure. Period. Let's come to terms with it. Let's stop pretending. Let's stop going. Jordan would not exist, as Mayor had mentioned, if it wasn't for Israeli assistance. Wouldn't exist. The Arabs would have killed Arabs, and perhaps we should have cheered them both on. But the point that I'm trying to make is that we, by virtue of the fact that we petition Mahmoud Abbas, a murderer of Jewish children, we petition him, please come and try to be reasonable. They are not reasonable. They are engaged in a religious war. Mahmoud Abbas, on June 15th of this past year, told Joe Biden what we've always known. He said, help us correct the injustice of the occupation of 74 years. He's talking about the occupation that began in 1948. Why would we dare? We stand at the United Nations, what? To try and convince Honduras or Bangladesh or Burundi that we have a right to exist? Mayor had mentioned Rabbi Kahana. Rabbi Kahana once said, imagine going to the ambassador of Finland or Poland and say, by the way, it's your turn to speak at the rostrum of the United Nations tomorrow, and we hope you're going to make a credible case of why Finland has a right to exist. He'll spit in your face. We don't. We are the people of the book. We're the ones. Let's argue and let's show them conferences and treaties and everything else, and try to convince the world that hates us to accept our right to exist. I want to read a quote that I prepared. It's a quote, it's about Jewish apology. It's a quote attributed to Max Nordau, Zionist over 100 years ago. He was talking about this, what Max Nordau said about our detractors. Here's what he said. It's a very short sentence. He said, if I despise myself It would be of no compensation if everyone else saluted me. And if I respect myself, it does not trouble me if others hold me lightly. Boom. That's it. We are a superpower. You're right. The miracle of Israel. 100 years ago, no one would have believed it. And yet the superpower petitions the Palestinian enemy. It petitions it. What's the two-state solution? The two-state solution, if explained to a 4-year-old child, is this: we're offering them a nation of their own if only they'll stop murdering us. Are we insane? Asked and answered.
Yeah, I would say my response to that is that, you know, that our policy, which is derived from our moral beliefs and our legal system, is based on a corrupt view, a corrupt, immoral, and false view of reality. That's why our policy is so, in many areas, in regard to this particular conflict, is so weak. And so, like, in fact, when I'm discussing these issues with friends, having leaders. So first of all, that, you know, in regard to, you know, the Mayor Kahana's idea about us being beggars and going around to other nations and asking for our permission, there's a few things. One, nations that came into reality through the legal mandate, as opposed to the ones who, you know, fought for their existence, you know, in as much as that most of the international community doesn't really understand the mechanics of the mandate system. And so they default to, most people don't know about the right of conquest, the mandate system, and the like. They still think that these are all legitimate ways to which assert sovereignty and create sovereignty. And our friends over in Russia and Ukraine are, you know, our test case for that right now. Vladimir Putin is, you know, he is completely trampling on international law, and he has his own views for that, but as a case in point. And so what's important for us, the evolution of us as a people, is that part of the responsibility of being a sovereign is having good diplomatic relations with other sovereigns. And so in as much as we have poorly managed our foreign policy around our sovereign legal rights, to the point where, and if you look into what actually happened, many times presidents of the United States told Israeli leaders to take more definitive action if they wanted the United States to be more forceful. It was the Israeli political leaders who told them not to do it. Even Ariel Sharon and the so-called, you know, this understanding that Ariel Sharon had with George Bush and the two-state solution. Not only is the two-state solution illegal in international law, treaty-wise illegal in international law, it's illegal in U.S. constitutional law. The President of the United States, by suggesting the two-state solution, was violating U.S. constitutional law. And Ariel Sharon, as the Prime Minister of Israel, was committing treason against the state of Israel. So when you start to frame issues in that way in order to counter what is going on there, and you're able to back it up, that is how the law as a weapon to be used to enforce rights morally and justly, that is the benefit of it. And diplomatically, you know, part of there's a halacha. It says, Esav Sona Yaakov. So it says, Esav hates Yaakov, but it doesn't say Esav Sona Yisrael. Yaakov and Yisrael are the same person. It's just when Yaakov is a level of Yisrael, and which is the combination of the attributes of Yaakov and Esav harmoniously together, when we combine that and we're acting according to the laws of the spiritual world and the physical world, we say our most important prayer, the Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, that prayer in which we say that God is Emet, is truth or reality, that when we act in that way, like an Israelite, and stand up and confront evil and fight those wars for true moral justice, that is in fact how we bring light into the world, and why the nations of the world, Rome, Asav, will respect us. We need to get outside with this. And
Henry, let me jump in for a second. There was a definitive moment when Yaakov was being buried in Hebron. This is important. This is critical, and I want everyone to pay attention to this. When Yaakov was being buried in Hebron, and there was this enormous procession that happened from Egypt to Hebron. And as they made it to Hebron, Yosef and his brothers, all of a sudden Esav appears. And Esav says, "What are you doing?" "Well, we're here to bury our father." "What do you mean you're here to bury your father?" "There's no legal deed that he could be buried here." So there was a whole commotion. Then they decided, you know what? We have someone who's really quick. One of our brothers, Naphtali. He's going to run back to Egypt. He's going to get the legal. We have the legal deed. He's going to go back to Egypt to get it. All of a sudden, there was a simple Jew that was hard of hearing, and he asked, "What's going on here with our, Yaakov? He's got to be buried. He's got to be buried. What's going on?" "Well, Esav is preventing it right now." So then he just thought, Esav's preventing it. It's a desecration. And he took matters into his own hands and took care of Esav. And with what's going on, I mean, we have diplomats from Israel. And I don't think they're too diplomatic in the Jewish sense. Many of these diplomats. And I used an example also as the envoy from Israel on anti-Semitism, Noah Tishby, when she says on Bill Maher's show, Real Time, "I'm pro-Israel and pro-Palestinian." I mean, these leaders, these people who are put on these pedestals to represent us, these experts, are actually committing what I consider to be a desecration of Judaism. They don't represent Jewish values. And that's where the passion should really be. That there's got to be, just like what happened in Hebron, what I referenced, there's got to be this passion to stand up that we're right. How dare you? How dare you even think of it to get in our way?
I don't think we need to operate that anymore because we are a sovereign.
I understand that. I understand that. But what I'm saying, what is lacking, is the passion of the Jewish idea.
That's true. And
everything's grounded in, yes, we do have the law. We have international law. We have the Torah. We have all this going. But at the same time, you have an engine, the BDS, which, of course, they have no effect on Israel in terms of trade and dollars and cents or anything like that. But what they do is that they could influence public opinion. And now there was a poll taken, a recent poll, that in the Democratic Party, almost 50% are for the so-called Palestinian cause now. So things have changed dramatically there. I'm just saying that on the diplomatic level, on the diplomacy level of advocating for Israel and our right, is that the passion is not there because the conviction isn't there, rooted into what it should be rooted in, and our roots are the Torah. And from there, what comes out of that is, yes, international legal rights as well. We went through the motions 100%, just like Avram our forefathers made purchases, legal purchases. They were told by God, this is ours, and then they followed through to make legal purchases. We did, and it's indisputable.
Yes.
But there's got to be that passion that we're right. Not only are we right, not only are we absolutely right, but the other side is absolutely wrong. And if we want to, and the only kind of compromise, I mean, You know, when we get into a discussion about PROHIBIT, it's really for the Muslim world to apologize to the Jewish people for having the audacity to build a mosque on our holiest site. That's really something that, and we don't ask for that. We make all kinds of gestures, and yes, well, let's sum up. Oh, God forbid, what's going to happen during Ramadan? What's going to happen during Ramadan? We won the war in 67, 6 days. We fought 6 days. We rested on the seventh day. We regained PROHIBIT, and we let them come up, and we let Jordan dictate to us.
Crazy.
We're not following through on who we are.
Well, it's because we don't understand our rights in Torah or in Israeli constitutional law or in international law. We're morally conflicted, and so in terms of being able to forcefully and you know, in an uncompromising way stand up for a position, it's because certainly in diplomatic terms, the message that we're being asked to deliver is so weak and untenable, and so it's difficult for our diplomats to forcefully and coherently represent our cases because we're asking them to be illogical and weak. So it's a bad strategy, and it's because it is not based in reality. It's based in a distortion. That's why we have to correct these things and ourselves to follow our own laws. The Israeli government, by not asserting de facto sovereignty in all of Israel, engaging in the Oslo Accords, they're not only violating our rights in international, they're literally violating Israeli constitutional, criminal, and civil law. But in order to, those laws exist. The politicians shouldn't be doing these things. It's illegal what they're doing, but we need to stand up and push back in that regard in order for the laws to take effect.
Yeah, absolutely. Listen, we're running out of time, so let's everyone have final comments, final statements. We'll go with Mayor. Go ahead.
Yeah, for some reason I just vaporized. I got off, but I got back on. It's been enlightening. I will say this: Jeffersonian democracy will find no home in the Middle East. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. Not going to happen. Yeah, let's have Amalek read the Constitution and understand. And maybe a very simple comment, and it's a reflection of reality. And this is obviously an editorial comment. Finest people in the world, the finest people in the world are the Jewish settlers. They're religious, they're Zionists, they're the greatest mitzvah of all, the settling of the land. They're the finest people in the world. They have been demonized not only by the outside world, they're being demonized in Tel Aviv today. We are in trouble.
Absolutely. 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 Henry, go ahead. Final words.
Yeah. So you know, on that note, it's Rosh Chodesh Nisan tonight. So we know that the month of Nisan is connected to our Geula and redemption, and so that, you know, in as much as we represented the Lubavitch Rebbe earlier in the conversation, I'll give him a nod again. So he was talking about the original sin in the Garden of Eden. How do we move from the idyllic utopian state into a fallen world? And so it's basically around perception. So the first mitzvah that God gave to Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve, was to not eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And so the way that the first reads in the Torah, it says the Eitz Adat Tovara lo tochel mimenu. Says, so that's the first commandment. He gives Adam. He says, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, don't eat from it. So the sages say the tree of knowledge of good and evil actually represents our activities in the material plane. It's polarity. There's good and bad, good and evil, light and darkness. But what the Lubavitch Rebbe says, the way we're supposed to read that verse is the Eitz Adat Tov v'ra lo tochel mimenu. Says, from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, don't eat from it. So I think what's important for all of us to understand is, yes, there are lots of challenges that we face, big ones. There's sometimes it seems like it's overwhelming, but we know that there's Siyata Teshema, there's Hashem in heaven, that we ourselves, the mission statement of the nation of Israel is to be Am Sugula, Or Lagoyim, that we are a special nation and a light unto the nations. And that the challenge is of there is this good and evil in the world. And that every situation, whatever obstacle that comes to, since we know that God is behind of all these, all the events, that our job in those events, in order to overcome and correct all the wrongs that are out there, and there are big ones and difficult ones, and they're profound, but we have to don't eat from the ra, the evil, eat from the good. And we have all these tremendous resources that are in our hand, legal, material, and otherwise. We should use all of them, and with all of us, each one of us in our own way, with all our might, to fight that war so that we can bring into reality the existence that we want to be a part of.
Thank you. Thank you, Henry. Thank you, Mayor, for joining us. We'll have more shows. We'll explain the truth in detail, but thank you, everyone, for joining us. Again, I'm going to ask whoever is watching, please share this with whatever social media platform you're on, be it Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp groups. We'd appreciate it, or email lists. Send it. It's going to be uploaded in a moment on our YouTube channel as well, and we'll be sending that around and sharing it. So I'm just asking everyone to please share. Thank you very much. A very important evening, very important topic as we get closer to Pesach. We wish everyone, all of our supporters and viewers, Chag Sameach, and we'll have shows. We'll still have shows during just before Pesach and Chol Hamoed and after Pesach. But thank you very much, and all the best to everyone. Shalom, shalom.
Thank you.
I'm Yisrael.